So just in April this year, we did this coordinated takedown, and I love the name. They call it's Operation Cookie Monster. But with the FBI and domestic law enforcement across Canada, but international law enforcement, we're able to shut down a worldwide marketplace.
Like, I had no idea that the CRTC could execute a search warrant. That is news.
Yeah. I'm very fortunate to have such robust legislation, which does include that, right?
Today, I'm excited to bring you my conversation with Steven Harroun, Chief Compliance and Enforcement Officer with Canada's telecom regulator, the CRTC. In today's conversation, Steven describes Canada's anti-spam legislation and how the CRTC enforces it to protect Canadians and people outside of Canada from really bad email practices. I think that a lot of people in the email industry would share my opinion that CASL has improved the game for legitimate email senders while making it harder for the bad guys to hide from enforcement actions. In today's discussion, Steven and I also talk about the future of telecom regulation in Canada and how the CRTC is carefully balancing the interests of Canadians against the threats that are being posed online. I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Steven Harroun of the CRTC.
So, Steven, what is the CRTC's role in protecting Canadians from online abuse?
That's a really great question, Ken, and I appreciate the opportunity to kind of participate in this podcast. It's great. So as a Chief Compliance and Enforcement Officer, I like to say I'm responsible for everything Canadians like to complain about, which is telemarketers and spammers. Specifically, I'm responsible for the unsolicited telecommunications rules, which includes Canada's National Do Not Call list. Also responsible for Canada's anti-spam legislation, as well as the voter contact registry. So we kind of have a nice kind of suite of tools that rely on us to look after Canadians in this space, right? So I think it works out really well in that perspective. I think one of the important things to recognize is that, right, in a lot of these situations is that, Canadians don't have a lot of control over this. So they do need particular pieces of legislation. They do need a regulator. They do need an industry, which will help kind of support them in this space.
Got it. So what is Canada's anti-spam legislation?
Yeah, so we affectionately call it CASL because it's a really long title. And actually in the legislation, it has like a 3-sentence title or something like that. So we shortened it to CASL. So in CASL, it's kind of twofold. And I feel very blessed actually as a regulator to have such robust legislation. So kind of the first piece, if you will, focuses on commercial electronic messages, which is really about the fact that Canadians should not receive commercial electronic messages in their email, in their spam, or in their SMS without their consent. That's kind of the fundamental principles. Section 6 of CASL relies on that. Where I get really excited and where my folks get really jazzed up is CASL is really broad in that it covers areas like malware and botnets and viruses and that, that unknown, if you will, addition of software to your email where you haven't provided consent. And we say software, and yes, that applies to obviously, any antivirus software or any other updates from your software company. But, software also, pertains to that virus and malware and stuff. So that's where we really focus a lot of our enforcement energy is kind of in that space because as at the end of the day, as the CCEO, I need to look at how can I protect Canadians the most? Where is there the most harm, if you will, being affected on Canadians? And it's actually really in this more malicious space. I'll provide a point of clarity if it's helpful in that, both the telemarketing rules and the CASL legislation, I operate under a civil regime, right? So at the end of the day, it's a civil process. The federal regulator says you've been bad. We may issue a citation, a warning letter. We may issue a notice of violation, which would often include an administrative monetary penalty. We may do an undertaking with you, which is, if you will, a little more friendly, where we say, okay, we are seeing this activity. We know, this is happening. The company says, yeah, that probably shouldn't have happened, or perhaps it's a little bit offside on the rules. How do we fix that? So we'll do an undertaking, which would provide the opportunity for them to say, okay, we'll enter into an agreement with you. We will fix the problems. So we'll have a compliance program to show we fix the problems. and we will pay an administrative monetary penalty, kind of, if you will, for the errors of the past. So, so that's, it's a nice little framework in that perspective, in that, that's the civil regime piece, which is, I was going to say, which is very civilized. But, it's a nice common approach to how we approach things. The challenge, on the CASL side of the house, of course, and on the telemarketing side too, there's a whole, if you will, scam, fraud, criminal related element, right? And, I will often get told, by lawyers in the industry, by my own lawyers sometimes, like, oh, well, you're the civil piece. Someone else has to take care of the criminal piece. You don't have that authority. But you know what? Canadians don't care. When I speak out and about and Canadians say, can you stop the calls? Can you stop the emails? Can you stop the SMS texts saying, can you collect your money here? Can you click here? All ways just to steal Canadians' financial information, et cetera. They don't care that I'm civil regime. They say, well, you're responsible. Can you stop it, right? So one of the beauties of, for me, being, I run an enforcement team embedded within the communications regulator. And one of the key pieces, and I'm sure we'll get to it later in our discussion, is the benefit of that is if I can't enforce it, I'll regulate it. Because I've got domestic legislation, I've got a global problem. So, so we spend a lot of our energy kind of on a policy space is what if the call, never happens? So what if Canadians don't get the call? What if Canadians don't get that email? What if they never receive that SMS text message? I feel like we've done our job in protecting Canadians, because if the phone doesn't ring, they can't fall victim. If they don't get that SMS message, then they can't accidentally, click and go, oh, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe that wasn't my tax refund. Maybe that wasn't my CERB benefit, all those types of things. So.
And that's certainly a problem that everyone is familiar with, on a regular basis. Speaking of this sort of ongoing abuse that you oversee, can you give an overview of the kinds of complaints that CRTC has received from Canadians since CASL went into effect?
One of the biggest things I think is to understand, and people look at it and go, oh, but your CASL complaints have gone up. So part of that is I think I've done a good job, because the more people become aware about how to file a complaint and tell us what's wrong, then our numbers should go up. 5 years ago, we were getting 5,000 complaints a week. Now we get about 6,800 a week, which, you say, okay, that's a lot. That's probably 1/10, maybe 1/20th, maybe 1/100th of what's really happening. Like, we all know, anyone working in this space, that citizens consistently underreport, right? It's only the people who are really infuriated, maybe have more time on their hands, who have fallen victim, right? And, want to make sure that they're doing something about it and make sure that, someone else, their neighbor, their family member, whatever, doesn't fall to the same scam. So even at, 6,800 a week, that seems like a big number. My concern is that it's just a tip of the iceberg when it comes to that. So it's robust. I'm not short of complaints, absolutely. And we are intelligence-based enforcement, right, at the end of the day. So yes, I have, those, 6,800 complaints. We also we look at open source information. We look at providing information or getting information from our telecom service providers, from other private sector folks. And, I'm blessed with lots of research and data in this space. My folks take all of that and kind of slice it and dice it, and, we're actually able to look at where campaigns are and stuff. But you know what? Surprisingly enough, and I'm amazed, and I've been sitting in this seat for 5 years, is the basic of complaints still exist, which is about consent. And that's which I find astonishing, because I feel like we do such a great job at education and outreach. I feel like, we spend a lot of time with the industry on this is how you need to comply, with the rules. And, I'll step off a bit and say, you know what, I truly believe 99% of legitimate companies want to comply with the rules. They just need to know how, right? And we spend a lot of time with industry folks. We spend a lot of time with lawyers. We spend a lot of time kind of traveling the country in any way that we can, whether it be via a conference or a chamber of commerce or whatever, to kind of get our message out. Because the biggest message I always want to send is that there's no one way to comply, right? At the end of the day, big companies, teams of people, they can do this and they know how to do it well. But I often meet, small business owners who will legitimately tell me, I've got 15 minutes a week to make sure I deal with you, CRTC. So what do I need to do, right? And so while there may be a great big team for a big conglomerate company, I've got someone's, daughter-in-law who works in the office and says, okay, what do I need to do for consent? And it doesn't have to be a big database. It doesn't have to be a big program. It can be a handwritten note beside the phone that says, so-and-so says I can email them at this address, and like that's your due diligence. So, people always think it's a big thing. I think some of the very basics of the rules on how to comply can be very simple if you're a small operation, but they recognize that they have obligations. So I think, for me, that's a big piece. And anyway, I'll pull you back to where we're going. But, I think for me, that's a really big piece. So I still am amazed at the end of the day that consent is an issue, because I feel like I've talked about this forever to everyone. If you want to send someone an email, then at the end of the day, just get their permission and you're good to go. And there are lots of parameters around that. I mean, that's, if you will, the initial kind of email contact to say, yes, I can, and et cetera. But, obviously, if you purchase a product, then you kind of have that existing business relationship, so then they do have 2 years to, to interact with you via email if you provided your email address because you've purchased something, right? Which is great. That's part of the rules, and, but you can always opt out of that, right? And so, A, I didn't give them consent, or B, their unsubscribe doesn't work. And these to me seem like such fundamental things. And but it's it should be easy. It should be one click. I want to get out of this. Yes, I'll come back later. And and some people have done it really well and really fun and creatively, like, oh no, you're leaving, etc., which I appreciate. But at the end of the day, it should be easy for Canadians, because I'm all about this should be super easy. Getting their consent should be easy. Can we email you? And having them leave should be equally as easy. So I always remain amazed that is still our number one complaint is actually about consent. I would say, even just in the last 5 years, or even less than 10, in the last 10, our complaints have changed, right? At the end of the day. And that is part of CASL is a very young program. It's less than 10 years old. And so it's a very young program, but early days it was about, I didn't tell company X they could email me. And, and there was, of course, I was going to say, I feel like everyone's inboxes got flooded when CASL came into force, because everyone all of a sudden needed to say, do we have consent to email you? Exactly. So I think those were our early day complaints, at 5,000 a week, and people saying, it doesn't work. They won't let me, they're still sending me messages after everyone's subscribed, et cetera, et cetera. Now, a good 25, even more percentage is all about phishing scams.
So really, one of the successes that you've had since CASL legislation came out is to sharpen the dividing line between good companies and bad companies, right? By making it so that the most of what Canadians experience in their electronic communications is consensual. And so the stuff they're complaining about now, that 25% of complaints, is most, it's the really bad guys. And I think maybe the fact that the number of complaints has only increased from 5,000 to 6,800 a week is a sign of amazing success.
Well, I will take that, and we often get compared, right? I will sit at industry events. I will sit in front of parliamentarians, a couple times a year, and they say, "Well, how are things going?" And of which, of course, their constituents have lots of things to say, which would suggest maybe not so well. But I, like you, interpret complaints the same way, right? Like the even just the caliber and the quality of the complaints has changed, right? People all of a sudden now do screenshots and they will, email stuff to us, and which to me is great. That means we're doing our job a little bit better, and I do take that. But yeah, I think that I support that theory, because I think for me it's always been about early days of CASL was, if everyone's following the rules, legitimate companies, kind of like, if you will, the curdled cream rises to the top, which is maybe the more nefarious actors. So if you're getting an email from a company that you don't recognize, well, definitely treat that as suspect, and if you're getting an SMS message that maybe it seems too good to be true, treat that as suspect. I go back and forth on this, right? I feel like it's not fair to put the onus on Canadians to have to make these decisions, and we could talk on the telephony side where we've tried multiple things. And, I often hear from carriers, if someone doesn't know who's calling, they shouldn't pick up the phone, they should, and I said, maybe that works. Maybe it does, right? And we are all, have the advantage of call display, et cetera. But I always go to my 80-year-old mother who will pick up the phone, and it won't matter if her call display says, do not answer, this is not, you should never, the phone could be burning hot red. She will still pick it up because it's ringing, So I go to that de facto place of, I appreciate the fact that there's probably a whole generation of folks who never answers the phone. My 30-year-old son doesn't answer the phone half the time when I call, but maybe that's I'm always leaving him a voicemail and he calls back because he just doesn't answer any calls. But that is not indicative of Canadian population, and that is not indicative of everyone's behaviors when it comes to that, right? So to me, I struggle with, yes, I want to provide as many tools as I can, and and there are lots of great tools in the toolkit, and we can chat about that. But for me, it's not enough to say that it's Joe and Jane Canadians' responsibility. I think I have a responsibility. I take, if you will, my protection piece of my job very, very seriously, and I want Canadians, to be aware that this is a space that we're working in, that we're working hard in, that we're working with industry on, so that we can provide them as much information as we can. And I look forward to talking about a whole education piece later on if we have time. But where we can give them the information they need to make decisions. But my de facto place always goes to my 80-year-old mother, who will answer that call even if the phone was on fire. So because it's ringing,
which it might be, given the smoke season that we're in. So what are the sort of main categories of complaints that that Canadians report to you?
Yeah. So I think I've touched on it a bit. It really is about, I'm getting like 33 emails a day from this company, and it's funny. I didn't realize that actually either. Probably till the most recent holiday season. And I was out shopping with my nephews, and they're like 9 and 11, and out shopping with them. And I'm at, a store that they like to shop in. And of course, I get the whole spiel of like, get 10% off, sign up for our emails. It's not a place I normally shop. And, I'm a really bad shopper when it comes to that, because I'm like, well, what does it mean? What does all these words mean that you're asking me to click? And they just go, just tick, 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 and sign at the bottom. You'll get our emails. I tend to push a little bit just because of my job, and I want to know if the cashier's been educated. But typically, no, they just want you to sign at the bottom to get 10%. I'll take the 10%. It's okay. But I was fascinated at some of these stores, who do, like, I'll use Christmas or I'll use Boxing Day or whatever. It's like 4 hours left, 3 hours left, 2 hours left, 1 hour left of our sale. Like, you got to go online, you got to buy. Like, that is annoying. That was annoying for me, from a store I don't normally shop at. So that was an easy unsubscribe. That was just, I was with my nephews. But we hear that a lot from folks. Like, yes, I said they could send me a message. I didn't tell them they could send me one every hour on the hour every day. That's a big thing for us. And the other side, of course, and we started touching on this, is the pure phishing scams, right? And the pure how to get money from people, right? We hear a lot about, government impersonation scams, which are huge on the rise and a big challenge. And, we just finished tax season, which is always a big deal, right? Oh, click here for your tax refund. Click here for your GST check. If I look at the COVID situation, right, and the government of Canada put in lots of really great measures for Canadians so that, they could pay their rent and they could buy their food because they couldn't go to work. But it was astonishing to me how nimble and how creative the fraudsters are, right? And I've joked on more than one occasion that, once I've given them a notice of violation and they've paid an amp, I want to hire them because they are so nimble and they're so quick, right? We would, programs would be announced at noon, and by 5 p.m, people were already getting the SMS scams and the email scams. Fill out this form, put your banking information here. Like, it was phenomenal how fast they could be. And even on the telephony side, we'd have the prime minister standing up and there'd be like, 1-800 number flashed below his name, and they were spoofing that phone number before that phone number was even live.
Wow.
Like,
so they've got their telecom set up before the government does.
Exactly, which was incredible, right? Because then all of a sudden, and I go back to, vulnerable Canadians, and you look at it and they go, they're getting this phone call, they're looking at their TV, like, oh yeah, that is them, and oh, I am eligible, and yeah, here's my banking information, so you can deposit that. We put a lot of onus on Canadians, which just isn't fair in my mind. So we need to figure out how to educate more. We need to figure out how to give them the tools. But we hear a lot about the government impersonation stuff, and And, in certain circles, even in my own organization, it is about the email from your boss scam, which, probably, hopefully a lot of your folks are familiar with, which is like, your boss sends you an email. It looks like it's from their email. Like, oh, I've got an urgent situation. Can you go buy $1,000 worth of gift cards? That international delegation's coming. My admin's off today, like whatever. And it's easy to get caught up in that vortex because sometimes things do happen that fast. And some things, and depending on the organization you're in, someone's got them bought and sent and gone before someone says, what do you mean you didn't ask me to do that? Like, we see in the government of Canada, and back to just the knowledge of scammers is, March is kind of our year end in government, right? So March 31st. And we've seen a whole lot of scams now go through our finance department because, we're a public government institution. And they can look and say, oh, who works in finance at the CRTC? And they email all these finance people and say, oh, here's my invoice. Someone was waiting for it. Can you pay it? Whatever. And depending on the scramble of, a year-end exercise, depending on, if there's new staff, casual staff are often hired at year-end to kind of, help with all the last-minute invoice processing. That invoice could potentially get processed, and before someone says, well, wait a minute, where was that on the books? But the payment's gone, and try and get it back.
So essentially one of the customers for your enforcement branch is the Canadian government itself.
Yeah, exactly. Which is fascinating, right? But it just goes to show the nimbleness and the creativity. I have to give it to them on creativity. Yeah. Like they're just so fast and so quick, and they figured out the seasons, right? And I was talking about tax time. When we get to kind of the fall, it's like the vacation season, if you will. All of a sudden, a few snow flurries, and people are booking their winter vacations. We see a whole scam process go there. Like it is quite fascinating to me. So there's the cyclical stuff, which we can almost plan now, which is helpful because we can send out the right messaging at the right time from a public relations perspective. And then the other side of that piece is just like all the other gap fillers that they have, right? And just how quick they can be. Like, who knows what happens tomorrow that all of a sudden someone says, oh, well, we could probably try this campaign with folks and see if that works. And, and I wanted to get back to, just kind of, the definition of vulnerable Canadians. And people often think about that as like, well, he's talking about vulnerable Canadians, he's talking about low income or whatever. But it's not just about that, right? Yes, there are folks who are low-income Canadians who, when they see an SMS text message saying, oh, your $400 is ready, that's a lot of money, right? At the end of the day. And if you need that money to pay your rent next week, or you need that money to go to the grocery store because your 3-year-old's hungry, then you are very, you go, oh, thank goodness, and oh, I forgot I was getting that whatever credit, whatever. And that's a vulnerable Canadian. But seniors, and I've talked about my mom, like they're vulnerable Canadians because they are, they're not on Twitter, they're not on the internet, they're not, and if they are, they're not following the tweets from the CRTC saying, worry about this scam, or from the hydro company who's tweeting it out. That doesn't help my mom who's not on a computer, right? So, so there's the seniors, but then there's new immigrants to Canada, right? Who don't speak English or French and who don't know the rules, right? And, we have the CRA tax scam, which I say is like collect your refund here. The one we often hear about and is just like, oh, you owe taxes and you'll be deported. And if you don't know English or French and you're just trying to cobble together, and someone says you're going to be deported if you don't pay, $500 dollars in Apple gift cards, that's a huge concern and a huge worry and a huge risk, right? So they're going out finding $500 and they're sending off those Apple iCards because they're concerned about the fact that they've just landed in Canada and they're trying to navigate their way through an immigration system. So it's, so it is a whole broad swath of folks, across Canada who can potentially, fall victim perhaps more readily than others. I feel super lucky. I work in this space, so I am very familiar. I am suspect of everything, and I tell my wife and my son and my family or whatever, like, if you don't understand it, don't click on it. Call me, email it to me, whatever. But but I'm lucky, right? I'm in a very privileged position that I work in this space and I understand the scams and I understand what's going on. And it's ironic, even the space that I'm in. my wife had entered into this email exchange with this guy about, so-and-so's birthday's coming up. I need to get a gift. I don't get paid till next week. And it was literally from her sister's email.
Wow.
And my wife's looking at it going, okay, it's a little abrupt, but whatever. So she starts emailing back and forth, kind of like, well, sure, what do you need? Like, how can I help? Like, whatever. And all of a sudden, the person said, well, I needed to go buy a $500 gift card for this store. And my wife's like, there is no way my sister's buying a $500 gift card for an 8-year-old's birthday.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Maybe,
and then she told me after the fact, but it was interesting, even that, because, and even, very intimately aware about this space, but she looked at we have, everyone's trained, look at the email address, whatever, but it had come from her sister's email.
Somehow.
Yeah, exactly. They've copied it, and then, of course, then she calls her sister and says, I think you've got a problem. She calls the service provider, and they go in and look behind the scenes and say, oh, basically they're redirecting everything that's coming to your email to them.
Wow. And then you got to think of all the implications.
Well, exactly. All the implications around it. So then all of a sudden she's trying to send out Facebook messages and calling people and saying, I'm not asking for anything, right? So it's fascinating to me, they become more successful because they're becoming more savvy, right? We keep telling everyone, oh, look at the email header, look at whatever. So now they make it look real. And, even just the evolution over the last little bit, I used to tell my friends and stuff oh, if it looks like it's from your bank, right? And banking is obviously another big issue. I'm like, go click on the bottom links, which say, ask about us, contact us, whatever. And that's where you'd click on them and it would fail. Right? And I'd be like, there's a good indicator. But now all the new scams, they've fixed all that. They still send you, and it looks like the real page again.
I mean, I got to say, recently, the kinds of SMS phishing I've been getting are very sophisticated. They have a CAPTCHA at the beginning, so you couldn't automate the crawling of that website with any kind of cloud service tool. And then you click through, and it's like Royal Bank's website, and it's perfect. It's pixel perfect with the real thing.
Absolutely.
I've never fallen victim to it because I work in this space, but my parents probably would. And this is happening all the time.
Yep. I look at I talk about my mother. I'll look at my mother-in-law, who's a little more tech savvy, who has an iPad and whatever. But, if she gets an email from her bank saying, oh, you're overdrawn or whatever, she would be trying to navigate on the iPad. How do I transfer money? How do I, and all those things, because it would be such a concern to her, and without asking any of us, because it came in her email. It must be true. Right.
Right.
And she is, over 80, and that is a concern. You're like, because she's mastered what she needs to do. She can get the photos from her grandkids, and she can get, when we're traveling, we'll probably send her pictures, from here while we're away. But all the other stuff, she just assumes it's real, because why else would they have my email address? Why else would they, So it's really quite fascinating and concerning, right? Obviously, at the same time.
Yeah, and these are your problems. You're the regulator, and Canadians are expecting you to somehow solve what you said earlier is really a global problem, right? Canadians are not just being targeted from within Canada; they're being targeted by foreign actors, even potentially foreign governments, with misinformation campaigns and attempts to steal their information. So, are there particular industries or sectors of the economy that tend to generate higher complaint rates? I mean, off the top of my head, I'm thinking, email marketing in particular would probably be a
absolutely.
A source of complaints.
It would definitely be our retail and services sector.
Yeah.
By far, it's probably over 60%.
Right.
When it comes to, I was going to say, I'll call them legitimate complaints, but legitimate concerns about Company X is not supposed to email me anymore. Company X is emailing me too much. Company X, unsubscribe doesn't work, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're at over 60% probably retail and services sector. Yeah. Absolutely, for sure.
Yeah. And the balance of, the other 40,
it's kind of a mix, right?
Yeah.
So, sometimes it's, Joe Handyman that you've hired for a particular service or something like that. We don't get as our complaints about the banking industry, for example, are actually more about the phishing side of things
Right.
and stuff like that.
Right.
But legitimate is definitely a retail side, for sure.
I mean, that kind of doesn't surprise me.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And we all do that, right? We all, like I said, I gave the example of me and my nephews. Sure, I'll take 10% because all of a sudden these clothes cost a lot. My son's in his 30s now. That's, it's not the same price as clothes anymore when you're 9.
Yeah, totally. So shifting over to the enforcement side, I mean, CASL obviously has a lot of power, gives the government a lot of power relative to what other countries have been able to establish through legislation. So what are some of the notable enforcement activities that your branch has been taking part in recently?
Absolutely. And we've been doing some amazing work, and I was going to say I can probably put it in a couple different buckets, if you will, or categories of stuff. Our more traditional enforcement, our more traditional investigations, are back to that, commercial electronic message, right? You shouldn't be emailing me. You shouldn't be doing this. I think we've done like 5 notices of violation in the last little bit, with administrative monetary penalties assigned to that. We've got some undertakings related to that. A really good one as an example. We did an undertaking with the Gap before Christmas last year, which is like, it was kind of the broader Gap range of companies, right? You've got the Gap, Old Navy, Banana Republic or whatever, where their unsubscribe was just clearly not working.
That's shocking.
Hundreds of thousands, exactly, and hundreds of thousands of complaints of people saying like it's not working and instances where this is not working. And they were really great. We kind of said, we saw this huge influx of complaints, and then all of a sudden my folks go looking, and then we talk to the Gap and we say, we think you've got a problem. And they were really great. They worked really well with us as the regulator, kind of like, oh, we think we've identified the problem. It's, some subcontractor of a subcontractor for one of their very particular brands. But they recognize the fact that, this shouldn't have happened, right, at the end of the day. So the undertaking piece, so that's kind of that negotiated settlement piece. If we come to you and say we think you've got a problem, and people go, oh, you're right, we do. They're willing to fix it. They're willing to enter into a compliance program. Life is pretty good. Our notice of violation tend to be a little more egregious in that people don't agree. Like, we think we disagree with your definition, or whatever. They're often willing to, pay an administrative monetary penalty or not. Or they can challenge it. They have the right to do that, whether it's to the CRTC itself or to federal court if they truly disagree, which I welcome, right? If the federal courts hold up a decision that we've made, then that's great. That's good precedent, right? We are administrative tribunal at the end of the day. The more decisions out there that kind of support our thinking and in what is a violation and what is not, the better.
Do they ever sort of try to make the argument that it's their charter freedom of speech right to be sending out these emails?
Absolutely. And certainly under CASL 3 or 4 years ago now, someone actually did take it to the Supreme Court and say, this is not fair. People should have the right to get whatever they want. We should have the right to send people whatever they want. But it failed. So it's upheld by the charter, which is great from that perspective. But I think one of the things I want to focus on some of the kind of traditional undertakings and the traditional investigations we have is that we've tried to be creative, right? If it's not been clear in this discussion, I take the compliance piece really big. Like we do a lot of education and outreach. On the enforcement side, I like to say we're innovative, right? And it's hard to imagine at the end of the day you say, okay, well, at the end of the day, they broke the rules. They should, pay a penalty for that. But we look at other ways in which we can get the messaging out, if you will. So we are very creative sometimes in our enforcement actions in that we ask folks, or I shouldn't say ask, we get them to commit to certain things like, in a recent investigation, we had lots of what I will call young folk because I'm old, but younger folks who think that they can do bad things on the internet and not get caught. These guys get caught, and we can talk about this dark web case in a minute. But one of the things we asked them to do at the end of the day, once they realized they were caught, is one of your conditions, if you will. I talked about big companies have to do compliance programs. When we deal with individuals, we said, okay, well, we want you to educate kids, at a youth network or something about the bad things on the internet, or how not to get trapped into kind of these things, or how there is no quick money scams, things like that. We ask them, we want to make sure they're not, repeat offenders, if you will. So we say, okay, for the next 3 years, we're going to reserve the right to look at your devices anytime we ask. So we try to be innovative. And when we look at big companies, it's not just about the administrative monetary penalty that gets paid to His Majesty, right? It doesn't come to me. It goes to the government of Canada writ large. It's also, okay, I'll take that penalty of $150,000, to the government of Canada, but then I want you to spend $100,000 over here to a charity which supports, things in this space, like educating Canadians, educating youth, that type of thing.
Right.
So we've tried to be very creative, if you will, in the enforcement space, because I think, I'm as I said, I benefit from legislation that is very broad, allows me to do a lot of things. So why not, if you will, make them give back? Because for me, I think that's just equally important. I'm the first to admit, I guess if I was a cost recovery program, I might think differently. But I think I can do way greater good if I've got a 25-year-old in a room with a bunch of teenagers saying, you know what, this might seem like a good idea at the time, but, I paid a $50,000 fine. I'm here talking to you guys, and now every time someone Googles my name, they're going to find out that I did this.
Yeah.
Right? At the end of the day, that's, maybe the good and bad of the internet is there forever, right? And maybe I'll say that, when I see this video perhaps. But at the end of the day, right, it's, I think that's important for them to kind of get that message out, to their peers and to others. And if we can have any role in that, I see that as such a huge win.
Fantastic. I love the idea that you have the flexibility to be creative, instead of just sort of being a fine issuing agency, which would create more of an adversarial nature to the
right?
process, right?
I joke all the time, when I'm at speaking events or I'm industry events, it's like, it's the age-old adage, right? If I'm from the government, I'm here to help, and we really are, right? At the end of the day, and even when I'm talking to my team, I'm always like, I want people to see correspondence from the CRTC, a letter from the CRTC, an inquiry from the CRTC. I want them to want to open it. Right? I don't want them to look at it and go, ooh, that's from the government and I want to look at that and I'll wait till later, right?
Or to complain about it to CASL and say, I
Absolutely.
never subscribed for this kind of notification.
So I want them to have faith in the regulator.
Yeah.
And I realize that's an uphill battle. But I think the more work we do in this space, the more positive impacts we have. When Canadians can see the fact that we're doing our best, and people's definition of best may differ, but we're trying to give them the tools and tips and tricks, and we can talk about that later. But
yeah,
I know, and I alluded to it in my intro to this question, but we've done some really cool work on the dark web, and and I talk about the commercial electronic messaging, if you will. That's kind of the bread and butter of our work, if you will, right? That's where a lot of the violations occur. As I said, protecting Canadians in this more nefarious space is really important to me. It's really important to my team. So last year, we did an investigation where we were able to kind of connect 3 or 4 people who had stolen Canadians' financial information, who were making it available for sale on a dark web marketplace. And it's kind of 4 people in very similar jurisdiction of Canada. But we're able to kind of investigate this through a bank, believe it or not. One of the challenges we have, and I talk about being civil and being criminal, one of the benefits of my legislation is, it sounds like a very nuanced condition, but people can bring me a case on a platter and basically say, I'm seeing this, can you help me? Because I say we're complaints-based, we're intelligence-based, but we can also have someone say, I think this is a problem. So we actually had banks coming to us saying, we are seeing a huge, they're taking lots of losses, obviously, right? People are being scammed out of their money. Their bank accounts are being drained. I think the financial sector is trying to wrap their heads around how do they protect their own interests, but protect their customers' interests. And, and a lot of that comes down to dollars, right? A lot of that comes down to money. So we had the banks coming to us saying, we know this is happening. We think we even know where it's happening. We think we know where the vector is. But law enforcement doesn't have time.
Right.
And that's fair, right? And I won't comment on the priorities of law enforcement agencies across the country. We just have to watch the news every night to know that there's a lot of conflicting priorities, right?
Sure.
At the end of the day. So we took this case on the bank and said, okay, well, let us investigate and see where we are. So we landed on 4 individuals who were doing this horrible work. We executed like 2 search warrants, got devices, got computers, whatever, looked at all that information that was available, and landed on, notices of violation for these individuals, which will now be forever, like I said, Googleable, if you will. And we shut down the largest Canadian dark web marketplace. And 18 days, 8 days, 18 minutes maybe, because let's be realistic, I talk about how tech savvy these folks are. But millions of Canadians' information was available like for $4.50, right? You, me, anybody in this building, it's cheap.
You did that through civil action.
Exactly. So our team was able to shut down that marketplace because as soon as they, we've got the 4 principles, if you will, and then it all goes dark, right? Because it's like we basically pull the plug. And, so I don't pretend that lasted long. Within minutes, within hours, within days, it was back up and running under a different name, I was going to say, I'm not the techie guy, but under different technical scripts and whatever.
Yeah.
But at least for a moment in time, Canadians' information was not available. And, and we were able to stop that, which is just, it's fascinating to me that we can have that kind of impact, and it's impact that's not seen, right? Like Canadians can't see that. They don't know that we've stopped someone from stealing their information and creating a whole new identity or, taking out loans in their names, et cetera. But the fact that we can have that impact, the fact that we knew that information was out there and we had to do something with it, and obviously as investigators and as, I'll say uber techie guys who work for me, they are ecstatic to be able to have that kind of impact,
Right.
And more recently, even, and I'll go to an even more recent case, just like a couple months ago, like we do lots of international collaboration, obviously, domestic problem, international, it's just crazy. But because of that dark web bank phishing case, we recently had the FBI knocking on our door saying, oh, we think we have a guy who is responsible, one of the key primaries in this global network. And we said, obviously we have to figure out where our piece is in that, right? So I'm still CASL, I'm still civil, I only have so many authorities. But when they come to us and say, we think we've got a guy, he's doing similar work like you did last year, maybe you can help us out. We're blessed with having the opportunity to work with law enforcement. I have MOUs with countries and law enforcement all around the world so that we can get work done together. That's important. So just in April this year, we did this coordinated takedown in a particular jurisdiction in Canada. So it's called, and I love the name, they call it's Operation Cookie Monster. So, you can go Google Operation Cookie Monster and you'll find out some details about this case. But with the FBI and domestic law enforcement across Canada, but international law enforcement, again, we're able to shut down a worldwide marketplace for the dark web, which is, it's just incredible. And, the achievements we're allowed to have, we get out of that is huge. And just that partnership and collaboration, and people realize like it doesn't have to be always law enforcement to law enforcement. They had to be creative even, with my regulatory colleagues around the world and kind of like, oh, what piece of, spam or what piece of SMS or what piece of whatever do they have under their jurisdiction, to try and get that creative, coordination. Because I get it. Every law enforcement around the world has priorities, and it's not always what's the priority that whether it be a company within your own country needs you to focus on, or an international company may come, an international law enforcement like the FBI may come knocking and say, like, we don't have time to do that. You want to do that in 3 weeks. We don't have time to do that. Whereas you can, come to the regulator, and I'll be honest, it was a short time frame. It wasn't 3, but it was probably 6 weeks, which almost seemed impossible. And when we were briefed by the FBI, I'm like, I really want to help you. I just don't know if I can do it in that kind of a time frame. But we pulled it off, and just such huge benefits, and just to show, that the internet has no borders. The enforcement piece shouldn't have any borders either, right? And if we can all play a small little piece of that, one of the little side notes, and is for my folks, because this is really cool work that they've become very skilled at and are becoming very known at, being able to do really well, is the FBI brought in a cyber dog. And, and I was like, okay, I don't understand what a cyber dog does. At first I thought it was a robotic dog. And I'm like, was that a robot dog? Like, what's a cyber dog? And what I never knew, and I've worked in this space a long time, is that in all electronics, they use a particular type of glue.
Huh.
In every cell phone, laptop, tablet, or whatever, they use a particular type of glue. So the dog is trained on the glue. So you bring in a cyber dog because, we executed search warrants into particular suspects' homes. So you bring in the cyber dog to find the devices.
Wow. So if they're hidden behind a couch.
Absolutely, right? So, as a search team, you don't have to start ripping up all the floorboards in someone's house, but really cool, like just a really cool tool to use, right? And, and it's interesting because I even had, I had some legal advice that suggested like, oh, that might be a breach of privacy, whatever. Right. But at the end of the day, when you're executing a search warrant, it's for the whole property. And actually what the cyber dog did in this case, it actually meant we could be focused on where we're focusing our attentions, right?
So you're actually being less privacy
We're actually being less,
infringing.
exactly, right? The ones that are on the desktop, the ones that are on the coffee table, that's easy.
Yeah.
But she pointed stuff out in a closet. She pointed stuff out in some weird little, cubby or whatever, which was just fascinating. And for me, it was really cool. Now, I came back and told my boss I need to buy a cyber dog, but then I got the price tag, which is a little pricey. And who's going to walk it anyway? But just cool to have those tools available to us, right? Like cool that the FBI was, I was going to say, come into town. We're going to help them execute, these search warrants. But they could enhance our game, right? We have, I'm very fortunate that we have really great tools that we use to be able to do our job. So something like a cyber dog, which seems very, if you will, traditional almost, but the effects that can have, and I don't know, it was really super cool. So I had to share that story because it's all about the cyber dog.
Yeah, you don't feel like the one thing you don't think about when you think about the CRTC is executing a search warrant. Like I had no idea that the CRTC could execute a search warrant. That is news.
Yeah.
For civil enforcement.
Absolutely.
You think about that in the context of criminal work, but not generally civil. That's very interesting.
No, and I often say all the time, I am, I'm very fortunate to have such robust legislation, which does include that, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise it becomes very challenging, right? My folks can only do so much behind their desk.
Right.
But if we can actually take those devices, I have no seizure powers, but I can take them temporarily. I can image those devices, and then I have to hand them back, which is fine. But I've got all the information I need, right?
Yeah.
I have all the intelligence, if you will, to secure our case,
right?
To take any actions going forward. So yeah, it's a really great power to have. Absolutely.
Wow.
I have law enforcement colleagues who go, I wish it was that easy for us just to go to a judge. No, there's a lot of work, right? You still need an ITO, you still need all that, and we've spent. My folks have done a really great job in just educating. Magistrates on this, like on this type of work and what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish, right? Because it's like anything. You said you didn't know. I think the first time we took a search warrant to a judge, I think she respectfully is like, I don't understand this. You're going to have to take me back to CASL 101 here to help me understand what we're trying to do, what you're trying to get. I was going to say I travel everywhere with a lawyer, but it's also like, okay, show me where your legal authorities are, help me understand. So, obviously they want to make sure they're making the right decision too. Obviously our offices are in a particular spot in Canada. So we're lucky we can often go back to the same judge or at least the same court where they go, oh yeah, I remember we did that. So you actually start educating even on that side. Right, so that they go, oh great, we're going to do another, almost like we're going to do another one, yay, because they see the value in that too, right? We've had magistrates say, oh, please come back and tell me what happened, which is, when it's difficult to get 22 minutes with anyone. Yeah, it's nice when they say, oh, can you please come back and tell me how this worked out for you, which is great.
Amazing. So you're educating everyone, even behind the bench.
Nope, absolutely.
Very interesting. It's fair to say. I think that the CRTC has been one of the more proactive telecom regulators in the world. And I say that as a bit of a layperson. I'm not really steeped in the regulatory world, but certainly, reading the news, you hear about frustrations in other countries where the government seems to be toothless in the face of all of this stuff. But in Canada, I mean, the word CASL strikes fear into many many marketers, even in other countries. What is on the CRTC's radar for the future? What's coming around the corner that you guys are thinking about?
No, absolutely, and it's a really great question. And one of the things I often say is I'm fortunate, and I think I mentioned it earlier. Being an enforcement arm within the communications regulator is really helpful. Because at the end of the day, if I can't enforce it, I'll regulate it. Which, if I was in a room with telecom service providers right now, they just roll their eyes at me or give me very angry eyes. But that goes back to that civil criminal piece, right? So I can't enforce a criminal action. But what if the phone never rang?
Yeah.
Like, what if the email never landed in your inbox? What if that you never got that SMS text message? So one of the things we've really focused on in the last 5 years is bringing that regulatory policy piece in, because it's actually really helpful. Because if I can enable telecom service providers to stop the phone from ringing and to block that botnet, if you will, like block that malware before it ever lands in your email, then I've also done my job. So on the telephony side, and I know we've been talking a lot about CASL, but on the telephony side, we've sort of introduced a bunch of different tools. Universal call blocking, for example, which is now like 3 or 4 years old. It's been since December 2019, I guess, where you should never get a phone call from 1-2-3-4-5-6-7-8-9-0, for example,
right,
or a number that's all zeros. Right, that just because it doesn't conform to normal numbering standards, right? 1, 6, 7, whatever. So we empower the TSPs to say, like, you can block those, right? And telecom service providers, it should be very important to know, like, they can't stop traffic unless they have our permission, right?
Got it.
And I should back that up a little.
Yeah.
Without the CRTC permission, basically they have to let every call go through, every email go through, if you will. They're just the pipe, right? They just, they get that message to you, be it telephone, email, SMS, because that's their job. They provide the conduit to do that. And for them to, if you will, interfere or stop a certain call or block a certain email, they have to have CRTC authority. So we started out with that. That seemed easy, right? Because that if you're getting 0000000, that's a scam call no matter what. Like, just don't answer it. So block that. So that was kind of the easy stuff. And then we introduced Stir Shaken, which is a technology at the end of the day, which is about authentication and verification. Because we live in a world of call display, and at the end of the day, it's Ken calling me. That's great. As we know, I think it's over 40%, and it could be over 50% now of our telephone side of the house complaints are all about spoofed calls. Whereas it looks like Ken is calling me, but then I pick up the phone and it's actually not Ken. Right? It's somebody else, and they're trying to sell me lawn services or duct cleaning services or roofing services or whatever, or they're telling me I'm in trouble or whatever.
Or a really popular one seems to be you get a phone call and it's got the same first 6 digits.
It looks like
as
your neighborhood.
Phone.
Exactly.
It looks like your neighborhood, and then you answer it because you're like, well, it looks like it's my cell phone number. It's,
absolutely, right.
Yeah.
And I was gonna say, I feel like the telephone guys got a little better at one point. It looked like you were calling yourself. So then all of a sudden, people were like, oh, we did that wrong. They went a little too far on that one. But what Stir Shaken does, and what we've mandated the providers now to do, is to be Stir Shaken compatible, if you will.
Right.
Now, it only works on voice over IP right now. So, I mean, that's a lot of our mobile networks, which is great.
Right.
It's still a small percentage of, if you will, our landline networks, because, the landlines at the end of the day are still old TDM, traditional, whatever. But they're all evolving. Networks will evolve, right? But one of the mandated things is you must be Stir Shaken compatible on your IP piece of business. And what it does in a nanosecond of time, and my real easy explanation is, at the end of the day, you call me. It goes through, obviously, the telecom, provider, and they authenticate that on the other side. So if we happen to be on different providers, that call comes into my provider, and in a nanosecond, they go, yep, that's Ken from his house, green check mark. Or, yes, this is Ken, or whatever they decide to use, and that's all evolving. So when it lands, when the phone rings instantaneously, but when the phone rings, it says, yep, you can answer it, it's Ken.
Yeah.
But if they can't make that authentication, right? If they can't do that, then at least it will come in and it'll say, likely a scam.
Yeah, I see that sometimes.
Because it says it's Ken, but it doesn't look like it's coming from Ken's house.
Yeah.
So we don't think it's Ken. So then it's like likely scam or suspect or something like that.
Yeah.
And what that does is, I talked about giving Canadians lots of tools, and maybe that still won't work for my 80-year-old mother who I talk about often. But at the end of the day, at least Canadians know to treat that call with caution.
Right.
Right? At the end of the day, when they pick up the phone, it looks like the bank, but the call display says probably not your bank. At least when they say, oh, we just need to verify your credit card number, you can be like, no, thanks, click. At least it provides that extra level. We're, probably at 10%, take up at this point because of the networks. The TSP providers are getting themselves ready, which is great. And even they're figuring out kind of that checkmark X, likely fraud, likely scam. They're even just figuring out that language amongst themselves of what to use. But it's one more tool, and like I said, I'll probably never stop all the calls. I'll probably never stop all the emails. I'll probably never stop all the text. But the more tools I can give folks, the more information I can get, the better. Also on the telephony side, and I'll move back to CASL. I'm sorry, I'm very passionate about all the work we do. On the telephony side is during COVID, one of our major providers came to us and said, oh, we're seeing this scam. We know it's a scam. We can tell, I always say by the techie piece because I'm not the techie guy, but they can identify this particular type of call as being a scam. Can we have permission? And they're doing this through AI, which is fascinating to me. And, I've heard you talk about AI recently, and I was going to say, I feel like we're all behind. So, in that space from a regulator's perspective, we're all behind. Anyway, they were going to use the AI to kind of identify these calls, and they wanted to block them. Back to they needed our permission. We said, okay, try it. And, I'll be honest, it took us a little while. They did a pilot, and then they come back and say, can we do it forever and whatever. But, in 2 years, and they started during COVID, they've blocked over 2 billion calls.
Billion
as in B, with 0 false positives, because as the regulator, of course, we said, okay, you can block it. We need to disclose publicly how you're going to do it. And we need a public process if you block a call by mistake, right? And that's always the biggest concern, right? Or that might have been the hospital calling, or that might have been someone else calling, and whatever. And it'll be the same on the email side. But they've had 0 false positives and 2 billion calls. So for me, that's 2 billion calls that have nenever rang.
I mean, in a way, you just want to make it so that at the very least, Canada is a bad target.
Absolutely,
for these guys,
right? And I think you're absolutely right. I think I was going to say, not that I want to push the bad actors somewhere else, but if they see we're putting all these measures and all these tools in place, it may be less attractive to try and scam Canadians, right?
Right.
Because it may just be, it may not be worth their effort, right? Because presumably, obviously, we're on the opposite side of this, but if we're on that side, there's got to be a return on the investment somewhere, right? They've got to know that 1/100th of the person will fall for the scam, and there's a business model there, clearly, right? But if we can stop 2 billion calls, and that's innovation from the TSPs. I won't even take credit for that, other than I guess holding them accountable for. From a regulatory perspective on the process and who and what and how and what's the recourse mechanism and all that, type of thing. But, with stir shake, and, I think that's another tool. Universal call blocking, I was doing math the other day. I was doing an interview, and I said, even if it was 1 call a week for every Canadian, that's like 790 million calls a year.
Right. That's
not happening. That call's not going through, for me, they're just huge wins, right? And I can't quantify that from I've done an investigation, I've taken enforcement action, I've collected administrative monetary penalties. But if I can stop billions of calls from ever happening, that's a huge win for me.
That sounds pretty good.
And then I'll go, and then I'll take us back to the CASL side, because, we've been I was going to say it's been a little slower on the policy side on the CASL side because it's also very young, right? A very young space. Right. So once we're having all this success on the CASL side of my house, or on the telephony side of my house, I went to my CASL folks and like, okay, so how do we stop the emails? And they were like, well, you can't stop all the emails, right?
Yeah.
My folks, keep me honest at least. And they were like, well, if we could identify the malware, if we can identify the botnets, if we can identify the viruses, and if we can find a way to do that, we could give the service providers the ability to block those types of things. So, we're actually sort of midway through that process, and we started this last year. And so we've come up with kind of a preliminary framework where we will do exactly that. We will give TSPs permission to block the emails that contain particular types of botnets and viruses and malware, all the bad things, let's be honest.
TSPs.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
So we will allow them to stop that email from ever landing in your inbox.
Huh.
Because it's interesting for me because this one's a hard one, right? Like a call is easy, right? People can pick up the phone and they go, oh, I got called by whoever. It doesn't matter. I wasn't supposed to get that call. It's easy for them to make that complaint. If I look at like a malware or a virus or whatever, if it's coming in through your email, at the end of the day, I've got two problems, right? I've got a jurisdictional problem because, I think I was talking to my folks at Spam House recently, and I think it's like the US, China, Russia, where the top 3 countries right now where all the botnets, malware, viruses are coming from. Okay, so I'm a domestic regulator in Canada. That's hard for me to fix, right? It's way outside my jurisdiction, and probably I don't have those tools. I've got a lot of tools, probably don't have those ones. And the other side of that for me is that Canadians are completely unaware, right? You've clicked on that email and you went, oh, that was just junk email, or I don't know what that was. And, oh, I thought that was supposed to be a funny video, and nothing happened on their computer. But their computer is now compromised.
Right.
Their computer is now stealing their financial information. Their computer is actually, in some cases, true botnets, or it is now a vector to steal other people's information and to email your contacts and all those types of things, right? But Canadians don't even know that's happening, right? Like they've clicked on that button and they've now turned their computer into a vector for bad things by someone else who's controlling it. And they don't even know that's going on. So for me, if we can stop one of those emails a day, but if we can stop, the millions, I am sure the number is once we start looking at this, if we can stop those emails from ever landing in people's inboxes, then I think we've done really great things, and I think that for me will be a huge win on the CASL side of the house where I can say, but you're getting fewer of those. Right?
So in the email space, I think one of the things that definitely complicates the situation for the regulator is the fact that a lot of people's mailboxes are hosted with foreign providers. And they may have a presence in Canada. So you may be able to give them, you may be able to give their mailbox provider some permission to do things.
Yep.
So that they have that flexibility. Is that your focus, or are you sort of looking at like enabling big mailbox providers to do stuff in Canada that they might have hesitated from doing in the past because of concerns about privacy or concerns about freedom?
It's definitely the latter, right?
Yeah.
The more tools I can give them, I want, and I say we're mid-process. We've given our preliminary views on what we want the framework to look like. We've gotten some advice recently that says, oh, you might have a problem here, you might have a problem there. I want the broadest, most robust system possible, right? Because at the end of the day, back to my TSPs can't block anything without permission. If I tell them block botnet 724, then that's all they can block is botnet 724, right? If I say block something with the characteristics of 724,
right,
then they can block a suite of things, right? But if I give them 724 and 787 comes up, they actually have to come and ask my permission again as the regulator. Well, can we block 787? It looks the same as 724. So I want the broadest possible framework that allows them, obviously, accuracy would be important, just the transparency about what are you going to block. The only reason you can block it is for cybersecurity reasons. There will be a whole criteria on around what they can block and why, but I want it to be nice and broad. For two things. A, because I think everything is so discrete, just blocking one particular type, then they'll just do something different, right? Back to how nimble, the fraudsters are. The other piece of that for me is it's big telcos versus little telco, right? So if I make it as broad as possible, the big telecommunications company is going to be like, oh, we've got whole teams on this and we can probably block 100 things a day. I may have a small TSP who's like, I can block one. I'm okay.
Yeah.
I'm okay if you can just block one, because at least for your small regional, whatever service or whatever, if you have the ability to identify one thing that looks like this, that's 100 emails somebody didn't get. And if the big guy has, the ability to block a whole bunch more, well, that's 1,000 emails that someone didn't get. So I want it to be, has to be transparent, obviously, and we have to have, back to that kind of false positive, we have to have a recourse mechanism and all that things, and I want it all to work smoothly. And, it'll take us another few months to figure out what that looks like. And, but it'll be, to me, from a regulatory policy perspective, and I sound like a true regulator now, but that, that's one more way, right? So, to me, that's enforcement. Even though there hasn't been an investigation, we haven't searched anyone's, computer. We haven't, that is true enforcement if we stop the calls, stop the emails, stop the SMS text. And I know we're running out of time, but, obviously SMS is just proliferous now.
Yeah.
And if anyone's, I was going to say, if anyone's listening, 99% of the time, if someone sends you a random SMS text message, collect your money here, it's probably fraud. Right? Because at the end of the day, if your friend is sending you money, if your parents are sending you money, if you're expecting a gift, if you're expecting a refund, you know where that's coming from. So if it's random and the amount is like, oh, it's more than I thought, there's a reason for that.
Yeah. It's almost like you need to advise people to verify.
Absolutely.
Like if you get a suspicious, or not even suspicious, but if anyone ever asks you for money or to click on something, verify it. In your own way, whatever that is, like go find your bank's website, see if they've announced anything about this, call the bank yourself before you take action, because the variety of these communications is endless.
Yep.
The bad guys are going to find different ways to talk about it. They'll always find ways to escape the filters. There's probably a mathematical theorem that says that that's always possible until the end of time. But if you have that way of verifying a generic message, you should just trust but verify.
Absolutely.
That might go some way towards helping the problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I know one of the things that we, as an email sender who are doing our best to detect bad stuff and block it, we're always, challenged by the risk that we block something inappropriately. And I know from our experience that having a regulator tell us it's okay to block this kind of thing would be very helpful, because I have a team who are very enthusiastic about blocking everything. And if they know at least some of their activities are totally legit and blessed by the government, that would be very helpful. And I think there's lots of organizations where people want to do the right thing and they're just waiting for the go-ahead.
Yep. And, and I think, pure government speak, I think that policy cover is important, right? And I respect the fact, that providers and email marketers and whatever all are very cognizant of the fact that they can't block things and they, it's not within the rules.
Yeah.
So if one of the tools I can give the industry is like, well, you have permission to block this stuff, we know it's bad, right?
Right.
I think my folks told me once, like, there are no good botnets. Like, don't let anyone tell you otherwise, right? And and I'm like, okay, that's good to know, right? Because but if we can provide the tools, to the industry, then I think that's important, that policy cover. And
if I might make a humble suggestion,
absolutely,
take it or leave it. But one of the other things that we struggle with is it okay to share this piece of intelligence that I've collected with somebody else? Because it's sort of like, well, I couldn't have gotten that intelligence unless I processed the email, and that seems kind of private, but I know it's phishing, or I know it's like stolen credentials or something like that from a phishing website. I want to share it, but I'm really scared because I don't want to be accused of violating someone's privacy. I think that's an area where the regulator, could give comfort in some ways, at least.
Absolutely. And I know when we embark on this path, the metrics will be important to me, right? Because that intelligence is gold.
Yeah.
Right. That is, and, like I said, we have Canadians who report to us. We look at data from around the world, from open source. We go to our TSPs and say, what kind of, things are you seeing? But even that aggregate level, right, back to that privacy piece, but even the aggregate piece is huge. So I can assure you, when we look at the principles for, if you will, this botnet blocking, it will come with a reporting, right? And, and tell us at an aggregate level what types of campaigns you're seeing. Tell us at an aggregate level, what types of, things you're blocking, because that will be critical, right? It'll be critical for transparency perspective. But I have an entire intelligence team that is going to slice and dice that up so fast that, it's going to make them really, really happy. And it helps us focus our investigation efforts. It really does. It helps us know where to focus our energies. I could have the entire Communications Commission working on spam and telephony files. Absolutely, right? I've got 1/10 of that, so I need to use my resources wisely.
Of course,
so
yeah.
The more intelligence we have, the better. And and I will. So it's about giving the industry those tools, and I think that's where the regulatory policy piece comes in. And if you will, I'll land on one of the things you said. What's next? So those policy pieces are important to me. One of the things I'm really focusing on now over the next year is that prevention piece, right? And there's no prevention in my title, but when I look at from a protecting Canadians perspective, which is in my mandate, the more people know, the more people they're aware, they're less likely to fall victim, right? So I am embarking on, and I challenged my folk this year is, we really need to amp up our prevention game. And I think we do a really great job. I think we could do an amazing job. And we're really trying to focus on, I talked about the vulnerable communities earlier, but it's like, I was asking my team, I said, okay, like what other languages should we be publishing information in? Right?
For sure.
Because, we're the government of Canada, we do everything in English and French. But back to that immigrant who may not speak English or French, I'm sure there's a StatsCan survey out there will tell me, the mother tongue of most Canadians. If we can put information out there in those languages, people become aware that immigration/tax/whatever scam, oh, that's a scam, right? But if no one's ever told them, and even if they have told them in English, they may not quite understand, or French, they may not quite understand. So if we can put it in their mother tongue and say, these are the scams we see and you should not fall victim to that, that is helpful. I'm looking at, I look at my 80-year-old mother, and I was sitting on a plane recently beside a senior citizen, and she was asking what I was doing, and she was like, she goes, I don't understand why my grandkids don't tell me about this. And I said, oh my gosh, you've given me the most brilliant idea. How do I get young Canadians educating their grandparents?
Yeah.
Grandma, I'm never going to be in jail where they're going to be asking me for money to get me out of jail. Grandparent scams are horrible.
Yeah.
They are just horrible. Because they play on that, a grandparent will always help you out no matter what. And they play on the secrecy. Oh, you can't tell anyone, but Jennifer is going to lose her job if they find out she's been arrested. So you can make this all go away if you just, bring us $5,000. And, they're just horrible scams. But I was like, oh, wait a minute. It's true. How do I get, the young Canadians to educate the more senior Canadians who may not be as savvy in this space, but they're the, I forget the recent stat, but over 40% of Canadians now are over the age of 55 or 60 or something like that.
Yeah.
So they are the ones who may not be as savvy, and they are the ones who will fall victim. So, I need the teenagers who never answer the phone and never answer, would never fall victim because they're probably way more educated in this space, or they know more about it just from their friends. How do I get them to educate senior citizens? How do I get that out there? And how do I even get back to basics from a media perspective, right? There are lots of community newspapers out there. There are lots of local radio stations out there, where we could be talking about, the scam of the week or the scam of the month, or are you aware that this has happened? And, I always say I love in Canada, we have, March is like anti-fraud month, and October is cybersecurity awareness month. And I love these months. The stories are horrible. Horrible, right? Because the media goes, oh, it's, fraud prevention month. And they go out and talk to Joe and Jane Canadian and say, well, have you ever fallen victim? Well, yeah, let me tell you what happened to me or my friend or my neighbor or whatever. So these stories happen a couple months a year. I want every week to be one of those.
Right.
So it's a big undertaking, and we'll take baby steps. But, I really am trying to focus on, we're doing lots of really great work on enforcement activities, on compliance activities, on giving, the industry the tools that they need. I now need to prepare Canadians even better, even more, just because everything moves so quickly.
And I think, with that, generative AI just entered the room.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, I think before November of last year, the technology behind things like GPT, it was such a nerdy research area, and it didn't affect everybody's lives. But then November 30th, ChatGPT comes out, has 1 million users within 7 days, 100 million users by by February or something. And then in March, they released GPT-4, which for all intents and purposes is intelligent. I just, I'm now this week at the MOG conference in Dublin. Everybody seems to be talking about the use of generative AI in phishing attacks, social engineering, and misinformation generally. Has this yet reached your desk? Are people starting to report generative AI-based attacks, or are there discussions going on about that?
No, I'm not seeing it. And which is and touch wood, and I won't knock on the table, but no, I'm not seeing that. But that's the next thing, right? And if I look at artificial intelligence, and and part of me is like, are you going to use it for good or use it for evil? We're going to see both, right? And if I look at, I talked about one of our service providers, they're blocking 2 billion calls. In my mind, they're using AI for good, right? They're trying to look at algorithms, et cetera, and whatever. We will get the opposite of that. So, invite me back in a year, and that's probably what I'll be talking about is, now the complaints I'm seeing are about this, which are going to be more difficult, right? They're going to be more difficult to slice and dice. They're going to be more difficult to investigate. They're going to be more difficult to put any kind of rules or regulations around. So
yeah, you start thinking about the possible combinations of AI, like use something like GPT to write the script, and then you use a text-to-speech generator to make the voice happen. Now your spam call is lifelike, and it understands what you're saying, and it engages in a nice conversation, and then you end up, sending money for some terrible product that you'd never wanted to buy.
Yeah.
I think that's got to be
or
just around the corner.
Donating to a charity, or you're
Right.
going to have I think you're right. You're going to have that voice simulation where they're simulating known voices and all that kind of stuff, and you're going to feel like you're doing this great thing, and I can't believe that this person called me, and it's back to if it's it sounds very, very classic. If it's too good to be true, maybe
It probably is.
Probably is.
Yeah, I think that'll never change.
Yeah.
Right. That's why when you're talking to senior citizens, if they get a call and it seems either too good or too terrible to be true,
Yep.
find a way to verify it, right? Because no amount of AI is going to dupe you. If you call your granddaughter and she says, "What? No, I'm fine. I'm sitting at home. I haven't been kidnapped," right? Yeah.
I'm going to steal that line. If it's too good or too terrible to be true, verify. I like it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much for the conversation, Steven. It's been wonderful. And I do look forward to seeing what the CRTC has to say in the coming year about the email space, stopping email scams. That will be much appreciated by millions of people if you succeed.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And by all means, I hope you'll invite me back sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steven.